There is a moment, buried in the middle of regular show's run, where a 900-year-old chalk-white creature, who used to be a teenage storm chaser, stands in his own attic holding a photograph that his younger self doesn't remember signing yet. And if you sit with that image for more than a few seconds, really sit with it, you start to feel something loosen in your chest that has nothing to do with the joke on screen. That's the show underneath the show. Regular Show spent 8 seasons pretending to be about two guys slacking off at a park, and it was that most of the time, but it was also quietly building one of the strangest, most internally contradictory, and most emotionally coherent bodies of time travel lore that has ever aired on a children's network at 8:15 on a Monday night. Every loop it built, it also broke. Every rule it set, it eventually needed to bend just far enough to tell the story it actually wanted to tell. And when you line all of those breaks and bends up next to each other in order, you don't get a mess, you get a shape. You get something that looks almost like a confession the show didn't know it was making about what it means to be young forever and what it costs. I want to walk through that shape with you tonight, slowly, the way you'd walk through a house you used to live in after the people who live there now have gone to bed. We're not doing a recap. We're not going episode by episode, checking boxes. We're going to start at the surface with the kind of paradox anyone who's watched 5 minutes of the show could point to, and then we're going to keep descending, layer by layer, past the goofs and the animation slips, down through the show's actual time machines, down through its immortality, down through the strange loop at the very center of its own finale, until we reach the part of Regular Show that isn't really about time travel at all. It's about the fact that Mordecai and Rigby are 23 years old for 6 seasons in a row while a child grows up in front of them, and nobody in the show ever says a word about it, because the show itself doesn't quite know how to look directly at what that means. Let's start where everyone starts, because it's the most honest place to start. The animation goof. The little glitch that lives on the surface of the show and never asks to mean anything, but which sets the tone for everything underneath it. There's an episode where Mordecai and Rigby, having mocked professional wrestling as fake in front of 3 professional wrestlers roughly the size of a garden shed, get thrown into a ladder match to defend their honor, and at one point during the beating, Mordecai's shirt tears open down the front. It's a small, human touch, the kind of detail an animator adds because it sells the violence of the hit. Except in the very next shot, the shirt is whole again. No rip, no explanation. Rigby is still screaming, the crowd is still roaring, and Mordecai's shirt has quietly, invisibly, repaired itself between frames, as if time had briefly skipped a beat and nobody noticed but the fabric. On its own, this means nothing. It's a production error, the kind every animated show accumulates by the truckload, the kind you're not really supposed to notice unless you're the sort of person who rewinds. But I want you to hold on to that shirt for a second, because it's a strange little preview, an accidental thesis statement stitched into the show before the show even knew it was going to spend the rest of its run doing this same trick on purpose. Something breaks. The show cuts away. When it cuts back, the break never happened. Regular Show would go on to build entire episodes out of that exact structure. Damage undone, timelines patched over, continuity quietly restored by anyone who happens to be standing nearby with a keyboard, a time NATO, or a ladder match. And it would do it so often and so casually that eventually you have to ask whether the show was actually interested in time travel as a genre or whether it had simply discovered, early and by accident, that its own universe liked to heal itself when nobody was looking. If you're watching this right now, lying in the dark somewhere, with your phone propped against a pillow or your laptop glowing on your chest, I'd genuinely love to know where you are and what time it is for you. Drop it in the comments. Not because I need the number, but because there's something nice about knowing that somewhere out there at 2 in the morning or on a lunch break or on a bus that smells like wet umbrellas, someone else is thinking about a cartoon about a blue jay and a raccoon hard enough to still be here 20 minutes from now. All right, let's keep going down. The next layer down doesn't look like a paradox at first. It looks like a joke about a boss who won't let his employees stay lazy in the way that most kids on Cartoon Network wanted to be lazy. Mordecai and Rigby are both 23 years old. Mordecai says it out loud himself in the second episode of the entire series, back when the show still felt like it might just be a hangout comedy about two guys who mow lawns and avoid work. 23. It's a specific number, not a vague young adult gesture, and the specificity matters because a specific number is a promise. It's the kind of detail a writer puts in when they expect the audience to be able to check their math later. And for a while, nobody does. You watch two guys skip work, get in trouble with a boss shaped like a gumball machine, get grounded by a park owner shaped like a stick of rock candy, and the show feels suspended in a permanent, late adolescent present tense, the way a lot of good hangout shows do. Time in that kind of show isn't really time. It's mood. It's Tuesday, forever, and nobody minds. Except Regular Show kept accumulating years around the edges of that permanent Tuesday, almost without meaning to. There's a birthday episode built around a boy named Timmy, Benson's nephew, turning 10 years old, and the framing of that episode leans on flashbacks of the whole gang watching Timmy grow up as an infant, as a toddler, as a small boy in successive stages, the kind of montage you only build when you want the audience to feel the accumulated weight of years passing. Do that math honestly, and something breaks immediately. If Timmy has gone from a newborn to a 10-year-old in the time Mordecai and Rigby have worked at the park, then Mordecai and Rigby have been groundskeepers for roughly a decade. And if that's true, then the 23-year-old Blue Jay from the second episode should, by any ordinary accounting of time, be somewhere in his early 30s by the time that party happens. He isn't. He's still 23. He is always 23. He will be 23 in the middle of the show's run, 23 near the end of it, 23 across seasons that reference years of employment, years of history with Margaret, years of missed opportunities and repeated mistakes, years that pile up around him like snow around a lamppost that never gets any taller. This isn't an isolated slip either, which is what makes it worth pausing on rather than shrugging off as a one-time animation team oversight. Fans who've gone back through the show scene by scene have found the same contradiction sitting quietly in half a dozen other places. An offhand line here about how many years someone has worked at the park, a holiday special there implying a decade or more of accumulated Christmases and Halloweens. And every single time, the show simply refuses to let its two leads age past the number it committed to in episode 2. And this appears to have been a conscious choice by the creator rather than a mistake the writers kept stumbling into by accident. J.G. Quintel has talked at fan conventions about wanting to keep Mordecai and Rigby locked at 23 indefinitely, the same way The Simpsons keeps Bart 10 years old through 3.5 decades of real-world time, or the way Pokemon keeps Ash a kid despite having technically lived through enough adventures to fill several lifetimes. I want to be careful here and mark clearly what's confirmed and what isn't. It is a documented fact that the show states the number 23 early on and never revises it, and it is a documented fact that other episodes independently imply the passage of many years. Whether every single one of those implications was a deliberate authorial choice, or whether some of them are ordinary continuity slippage that nobody bothered to fix, we can't know for certain from the outside, and I'd rather tell you that plainly than pretend the show left us a signed statement explaining itself. But here's where it stops being a goof and starts being something closer to a wound the show doesn't know it's carrying. A number that never changes, while everything around it visibly ages, isn't really a continuity error anymore once a show does it on purpose. It's a kind of magic. It's the exact structure of every story about a person who can't grow up. Peter Pan refusing to leave the island, a portrait in an attic, staying young while the man downstairs rots. A summer that never quite ends, no matter how many autumns happen around it. And what makes regular show quietly devastating, in a way I don't think even its own writers fully clocked while they were making jokes about hot wings and mini golf, is that the two characters frozen at 23 are also the two characters the show is most explicitly worried about maturing. Benson is always yelling at them to grow up. Margaret is always just out of reach because Mordecai can't get his act together long enough to close the distance. Rigby fails a class, gets his GED, keeps almost but not quite, becoming an adult across dozens of separate episodes, each time snapping back to the same starting position like a rubber band. The show built an entire emotional engine out of the tension between two people who are trying, sort of, to become adults, and it never let the actual machinery of time turn far enough for that to happen, because the machinery of time in this show, we're going to find out, was never really running the way it appeared to be running at all. So let's go to the place where the show finally does let time turn, on purpose out loud, with a tornado made specifically for the occasion. There's an episode from the 5th season called A Skips in Time, and it's the first place the show sits down and actually looks its own time travel logic in the eye instead of glancing past it. The setup is almost absurdly simple once you say it plainly. A storm rolls into the park, and it isn't an ordinary storm. It's what the show calls a time-nado, a tornado twisted just enough out of true that anything caught inside it doesn't just get thrown across the sky, it gets thrown across centuries. A hot air balloon crashes out of that storm, and inside it is an unconscious teenage boy who looks, when Mordecai finally lifts the hat off his face, exactly like Skips. Because he is Skips. He's Skips from roughly 300 years earlier, a teenager named Walks sucked forward through time while storm chasing in the 1700s, and now he's lying on the floor of the park house in the present day, and the present day version of him is standing over his own unconscious teenage body, having what might be the strangest moment of eye contact in the entire series. The show spells its own rule out loud, almost immediately, through Skips himself, and it's worth sitting with the exact shape of the rule rather than paraphrasing it into something blander than it is. If Walks isn't returned to his own time, a whole chain of events that needs to happen simply won't happen. Skips says this almost casually, the way you'd mention a bus schedule, and among the things that chain of events includes is the very fact of Skips becoming immortal in the first place. Which means that for the length of this episode, Skips is not just trying to save a stranger. He is trying to save the specific sequence of choices that turns a teenage storm chaser into a 900-year-old Yeti who works at a public park. He's not rescuing his past. He's rescuing his own present tense in real time while it's actively at risk of unraveling underneath him. And the show does something genuinely elegant with this. As the hours tick by and Walks remains stuck in the wrong century, Skips starts, quite literally, to age. His hair grays further. His joints start to creak in ways they never have before. He begins fading, physically, toward the version of non-existence that would follow if the timeline caught up to the fact that its foundational event had gone missing. It's a grandfather paradox, dressed up as body horror, dressed up as a sitcom bottle episode, and it plays it disarmingly straight for a show that spends most of its runtime doing pratfalls. What makes this scene land the way it does isn't the mechanics, though plenty of shows have done the meet your younger self bit. Plenty of shows have done, if you don't get back, you'll cease to exist. What makes it land is the emotional gap the show insists on putting between Walks and Skips, a gap that has nothing to do with plot logic and everything to do with what 300 years actually does to a person. Walks finds his future self boring, stuffy, a guy who reads too much and helps people too eagerly and has apparently forgotten how to have a good time. And Skips, for his part, finds his teenage self immature, reckless, a little embarrassing, the kind of person you'd be relieved to have grown out of, if growing out of yourself were something that happened to a man who technically can't die. There's a version of this episode that plays the culture shock gap for laughs and nothing else, and this episode does play it for laughs, plenty of them, but it also quietly lets something sadder slip through the cracks. The distance between who you were and who you became is so vast, in Skips's case, that his younger self can't even recognize the shape of the road that got him there. It's not that Walks disagrees with the choices Skips made. It's that Walks can't conceive of a life long enough to contain them. 3 centuries is not a story a teenager can hold. It's barely a story a 900-year-old immortal can hold, and there are moments in this episode where you can feel Skips himself struggling to hold it, struggling to remember what version of himself made the promise that turned into the life he's been quietly, patiently living out ever since. There's a smaller detail buried in this episode that most people skate right past, and I want to slow down on it because it's the kind of contradiction that only becomes visible once you start reading the show's supplementary material against itself. In A Skips in Time, Walks is storm chasing with a companion named Tecmo, a fellow immortal with his own tricked out storm tracking equipment, and it's Tecmo's presence in the modern day park that essentially kicks off the entire episode. But if you go looking through the biographical material the show built up around Skips elsewhere, the wiki-level lore that accumulated across Skips' story, and various other episodes referencing his past, his teenage storm-chasing adventures get attributed, in some of those accounts, to a different friend entirely, a companion named Samson, rather than Tecmo. I want to flag this one honestly as a piece of fan-documented inconsistency rather than a grand unified theory. It may simply be sloppiness in how different corners of the show's expanded lore got written down over the years by different writers years apart, none of whom were necessarily cross-checking each other's homework. But it's worth noticing precisely because of what it reveals about how this show's history actually got built. Regular Show wasn't planned out in advance, with a master timeline pinned to a corkboard somewhere. It was built the way memory is built, one story told at a time, added to whenever it was convenient, occasionally contradicting the last story without anyone in the room realizing it, because nobody expected an audience to ever lay the stories side by side and read them as a single continuous document, which means every act of continuity in this show, every place where something old gets referenced and slotted neatly into something new, is a kind of small miracle. And every place where it slips, like this one, is a reminder that miracles cost effort, and effort has a limit. There's one more piece of A Skips in Time worth pulling out before we move past it, because it's the moment where the show, almost as a throwaway gag, states its own understanding of the grandfather paradox more explicitly than most science fiction bothers to. While the group is scrambling to find a way to send Walks home, Muscle Man mentions a guy he knows who builds time machines, and the story attached to that guy is a small, perfect, self-contained horror story. He apparently built a machine, used it to travel into the past, met his own father before his father had ever met his mother, and in doing so, through some unspecified but clearly catastrophic interference, caused his parents to never meet at all, which caused him, eventually, gradually, to fade out of existence entirely. It's delivered as a punchline. It's meant to be a quick, silly, oh that guy kind of aside, the sort of thing that exists mostly to justify a scene transition. But it is, structurally, the single cleanest articulation of the grandfather paradox that Regular Show ever puts into a character's mouth, and the show draws it in casually, almost carelessly, in the middle of an episode that is simultaneously living out its own softer version of the exact same fear with Skips fading in real time in the next room. The show knows what it's playing with. It just doesn't always signal that it knows, which is part of what makes going back through it now, years later, feel less like decoding a puzzle and more like noticing that someone left the light on in a room you'd always assumed was empty. By the end of the episode, of course, everything gets fixed because regular show is, underneath its horror adjacent detours, a warm show that wants its characters to be okay. Walks gets back into his own storm, back into his own century, and the chain of events Skips was so desperately protecting snaps back into place. Skip stops aging backward toward death, the timeline exhales, and the episode ends on something genuinely tender, a photograph signed by a teenage Walks who has just learned, in the space of one very strange day, that the boring life waiting for him is actually full of people worth being boring for. It's a nice ending. It's an ending that earns its warmth. But notice the shape of what just happened, because it's the shape that's going to keep recurring for the rest of tonight. The show set up a genuine paradox. Let it threaten real consequences. Let a character age visibly and almost die from the threat of his own erased history, and then close the loop so cleanly that by the next episode, nobody mentions it again. No one asks how close they came to losing Skips. No one asks what ceasing to exist would have actually looked like, whether it would have been instant or slow, whether the others would have even remembered him afterward, or simply felt a Skips-shaped absence they couldn't name. The show is extremely good at opening these doors. It is almost never interested in walking through them, and I think that's less a flaw than it is a kind of mercy the show extends to itself, because if you actually walked through even one of these doors all the way, you'd end up somewhere much darker than a Monday night cartoon about a park usually wants to go. Which brings us to the machine that started all of this, not the Time-Nado, which was a freak weather event, an act of nature rather than an act of engineering, but an actual, deliberately built device that Mordecai and Rigby use more than once, and which the show treats with a level of narrative casualness that borders on the reckless. Once you actually stop to think about what a working time machine sitting around a public park groundskeeping shed implies about the rest of the show's universe. The episode is called Bad Kiss, and it comes from earlier in the show's run than Eos a Skips in Time, which matters because it tells you the show was already comfortable treating time machines as a household appliance long before it ever slowed down to examine what a grandfather paradox actually feels like from the inside. The setup. Mordecai finally kisses Margaret after ages of build-up, after ages of near misses and missed windows, and the kiss goes wrong for the most mundane reason imaginable. His breath smells like the chili dog he ate earlier that day, and Margaret pulls away, and Mordecai is left standing there, having gotten the thing he wanted in the exact form that makes it useless to him. So what does he do? He does not go buy mints. He does not wait for another opportunity the way an ordinary, heartbroken 23-year-old bird might. He acquires a time machine. Rigby, in the show's own dry little joke about how normalized this technology has become in their world, mentions getting a discount for buying two, and Mordecai travels backward through his own day specifically to intercept himself before the chili dog happens, so that the kiss can happen again, this time with acceptable breath. Stop and actually look at what that means, because the show moves through it so fast, with such comic energy, that it's easy to let the implications slide right past you. Mordecai isn't just visiting his past, he is hunting himself. He is trying to physically locate and interfere with an earlier version of his own day in order to edit the outcome, which means that for a stretch of this episode, there are functionally two Mordecais who exist in the same afternoon, one of whom is trying to stop the other one from eating a chili dog he has already, from a certain point of view, eaten. And the show's own time travel mechanics elsewhere explicitly warn against exactly this. Never the selves shall meet isn't just a trope name. It's close to a stated law within the show's internal logic, the same law that made a Skips in Time so tense whenever Walks and Skips got too close to comparing notes. Bad Kiss breaks that law casually, almost gleefully, treating the danger of doubled selves as a source of slapstick rather than existential horror, which on its own would just be an inconsistency in tone between two episodes made at different points in the show's run. But then the episode does something stranger, something that I think is actually the most interesting time travel idea a regular show ever executes, and then immediately, almost violently, discards. Mordecai eventually catches up to his past self, and future Mordecai and future Rigby physically confront past Mordecai to stop him from following through on the kiss the wrong way. There's a moment where they watch their earlier selves from a distance, the way you'd watch a home movie you'd forgotten you starred in, and once they've successfully derailed the timeline, they don't just walk away and let the new version play out. They break the time machines on purpose, deliberately smash the devices that got them there, and the show tells us plainly that this act of destruction causes everything that happened between the first trip backward and that exact moment of destruction to simply never have happened at all. Not never happened from this point forward. Never happened, period. Retroactively, cleanly, as if a whole stretch of lived experience, the chase through several other past episodes worth of backdrops, the tense standoff between two versions of the same person, the growing panic of it all, gets folded up and thrown away like a rough draft. And then, and this is the detail that turns the whole episode into a small, quiet meditation on the difference between memory and history. Mordecai still remembers his breath is bad. The erased timeline is erased for the universe. It is not erased for him. He carries the knowledge of a version of events that, according to the show's own internal logic, never technically existed, and he uses that leftover knowledge to fix his breath the ordinary way, with a mint, seconds before Margaret can pull away again. I don't think the show meant for this to be as strange as it actually is. I think the writers wanted a tidy, funny way to give Mordecai a second chance without making the episode about grief or regret, and break the machines, undo the mess, keep the lesson was simply the cleanest tool available. But sit with what it implies about how causality works inside this universe, because it's not nothing. It suggests that erasing an event from the timeline doesn't erase the information that event generated in a person's mind. That consciousness, in regular show's cosmology, sits somewhere just slightly outside the timeline it's embedded in, able to retain fragments of futures and pasts that the rest of reality has already discarded. That's an enormous idea for a joke episode to be quietly resting on. And it's an idea the show is going to lean on again, much later, in a much bigger, much more consequential way, in an episode where the stakes stop being a single kiss and start being the entire park, and where the very same time machine, the very same model of device first used to fix one boy's breath, gets pulled back out of storage and put to use one more time for something that matters a great deal more. There's a visual detail in Bad Kiss worth lingering on before we move away from it, because it's one of the few times the show lets its time travel look like what time travel might actually feel like from the inside, rather than just functioning as a plot device to get a character from one afternoon to another. As Mordecai and Rigby chase their earlier selves backward through the day, the show doesn't just cut cleanly from one location to the next. It lets them pass, visibly, through fragments of older episodes entirely, glimpses of settings and moments the show had already spent seasons building, flickering past like scenery seen from a train window, a kind of clip show assembled not for nostalgia's own sake, but as a physical texture the characters are shown moving through. It's a strange, almost hallucinatory choice for what is, underneath it, a fairly small, low-stakes story about a bad kiss, and I think it's worth noticing precisely because of how disproportionate it is to the story it's servicing. The show didn't need to fly its characters through a corridor made of its own history to fix one afternoon's chili dog problem. It chose to anyway, which suggests that on some level, even this early, some part of the creative team understood time travel in this universe as something closer to a physical relationship with the show's own accumulated past than a simple narrative reset button. When Mordecai travels backward, he isn't just visiting an earlier version of one day. He's passing, bodily, through the accumulated weight of everything the show has already shown you, as if the past itself has texture, has rooms, has a shape you can actually fly a hot air balloon through if you know which storm to chase. That image, a person moving physically through fragments of their own history in order to fix one small human mistake, is, I think, as close as this show ever gets to admitting outright what all of its time travel was secretly about the whole time. Not escaping consequence, not erasing mistakes cleanly and moving on unscathed, though the show's own internal rules pretend that's what's happening every time a machine gets smashed or a loop resets. What it's actually depicting, image by image, is the plain, ordinary human experience of carrying your own past around inside you at all times, close enough to touch, close enough to fly through, close enough that fixing a single afternoon means brushing up against dozens of other afternoons you'd almost forgotten you'd lived. Nobody gets to time travel without passing through everything else they've already been. Regular Show just happened to be the one show strange enough and patient enough to actually draw that corridor out in full and let its two leads fly straight down the middle of it, chasing a mint. That episode is Exit 9B, and it opens the fourth season with an image that has no business being in a show about groundskeepers, the park in ruins, a bearded stranger dragging the entire staff away by force, and Mordecai and Rigby escaping the only way they know how, by grabbing the leftover time machine from the chili dog incident and throwing themselves 2 months into the future rather than risk staying in the present to be captured alongside everyone else. It's worth pausing on the fact that this is treated as a viable emergency escape plan. Somewhere in this world, in a shed, sits a device capable of moving two conscious adults across a span of real time, and when disaster strikes, nobody hesitates to reach for it, the way you or I might reach for a fire extinguisher. That's the level of casual, unexamined normalization Regular Show has built around its own most dangerous technology by this point in its run, and it's worth remembering because it's exactly the kind of detail that makes the deeper layers of this show's lore feel less like isolated gimmicks and more like a slowly accumulating pile of unexploded ordnance. What Mordecai and Rigby find 2 months later is a park that no longer exists. In its place, a construction site for a freeway on-ramp, cheerfully signed as Exit 9B, and a staff who have all been captured, brainwashed, and issued entirely new lives. Skips is running an auto shop and doesn't recognize either of them until Rigby, in one of the show's genuinely sharp emotional beats, brings him back by invoking the only thing 900 years of memory wiping apparently can't fully erase: the name of the one woman Skips ever loved. Pops is giving tours at a butterfly sanctuary. Muscle Man, in the episode's best joke, has become a university physics professor, immaculately dressed, entirely unrecognizable in manner, until Mordecai reaches for the one piece of identity that survives every possible erasure, a question about whose mother is a specific number, and the old muscle man snaps back into place like a bone popping into its socket. High Five Ghost delivers pizza, and Benson, worst of all, works directly under the man who destroyed everything, still performing the exact same role he always performed, still the overworked middle manager, just serving a different and considerably crueler boss. The reveal of who's actually behind all of it is where the episode stops being a clever brainwashing plot and turns into something closer to a ledger being settled. The bearded stranger is the son of a man named Garrett Bobby Ferguson, a video game rival Mordecai and Rigby beat, and humiliated years earlier in an entirely different, much smaller episode about an arcade high score. That earlier defeat, which felt at the time like a throwaway one-off villain of the week story with no lasting weight, has been quietly festering somewhere off-screen for years, incubating into a grown man's entire life plan for revenge. And when the younger Ferguson finally finishes his freeway and opens his portal, what comes out of it isn't just his own vengeance, it's everyone. Every villain the show had ever definitively defeated across its entire run up to that point returns through that opening, resurrected en masse, given one more chance to finish what they'd started in what amounts to the show's own version of a night when every unpaid debt calls in at once. This is where the paradox stops being about grandfathers and starts being about consequence, and I think it's actually the moment the show's time travel and time-adjacent mischief reveals its real emotional logic. Every single time Mordecai and Rigby have broken a machine, erased a bad afternoon, escaped a mess by jumping forward 2 months, undone a mistake with a time NATO or a keyboard or a ladder match. Every time the show has let its own version of history quietly patch itself back over, the way that torn shirt patched itself back over in an earlier, smaller episode. It has been building a debt that never actually got paid off, just deferred. Exit 9B is the interest coming due on years of narrative shortcuts. All those villains who got beaten and then simply stopped being mentioned because the show moved on to the next joke, the next Tuesday, the next 23-year-old afternoon. They didn't go away. They were still down there in whatever the show's version of narrative memory looks like, and it turns out the show was tracking them the entire time, even when it looked like it wasn't paying attention. Skips, without missing a beat, is able to summon his own set of allies to meet the resurrected army. Gary, Death himself, Tecmo, an anthropomorphic god of basketball, the same guardians of eternal youth who made Skips immortal in the first place, which tells you that the show's mythology had been running in the background the entire time, fully staffed, fully connected, waiting for an episode big enough to justify pulling all of it out into the light at once. It's worth stopping here and actually looking at Skips directly, because everything we've talked about so far, the frozen ages, the time NATOs, the broken machines, the debts coming due, all of it eventually orbits back to one character who has been quietly holding the show's entire relationship with time in his own body since the very first episode. Skips isn't just a groundskeeper who happens to know a lot. He is, by the show's own accounting, somewhere over 500 years old at the point the series begins, older than the country the park is standing in, older than most of the buildings around it, and the show reveals the origin of that age slowly, across years of episodes, in a way that rewards exactly the kind of patient rewatching this video is asking you to do right now. The origin story, when it finally arrives, is one of the more genuinely moving pieces of writing the show ever produced, and it's worth taking seriously on its own terms before we start pulling at its seams. As a teenager named Walks, expelled from multiple schools for fighting, Skips meets a group of strange, deep-voiced infants called the Guardians of Eternal Youth, along with their friend Gareth, and he learns that an old enemy of theirs, a towering, horned figure named Clorgbane, is destined to return and needs to be fought using an ancient set of weapons called the Fists of Justice. Along the way, Walks falls in love with a girl named Mona, promises her he'll never fight again, breaks that promise the moment duty calls, defeats Clorgbane, and loses Mona anyway. She dies, crushed by falling debris during the very battle he fought specifically to protect the people he cared about. And it's grief, not glory, that turns Walks into Skips. The Guardians offer him immortality specifically because Clorgbane, they calculate, will return again in 157 years, and someone capable of beating him needs to still be standing when that day comes. Walks accepts. He's asked to choose a new name to be reborn under, and thinking of the only happiness he ever really had. Long afternoons spent skipping stones, skipping rope, simply skipping through a life that briefly included someone he loved. He chooses the name Skips, and it sticks, and it becomes the only name anyone in the show ever calls him for the next several centuries. That's the story. It's tender, and it's sad, and it earns its sadness honestly. But once you know it, the math starts to itch at you, the way a loose thread on a sweater itches at you until you either cut it or pull the whole sweater apart. 157 years, the Guardians say, is how long it will be before Clorgbane returns. That's a strangely, deliberately specific number for a piece of prophetic lore to land on. Not a round hundred, not a symbolic century, but 157, precise enough that it sounds less like myth and more like scheduling. And when Clorgbane does eventually show up again within the show's present-day continuity, in an earlier episode called Fists of Justice that predates the origin story by years of production time, the confrontation plays out with Skips already established as ancient, already established as having fought Clorgbane at some unspecified point in the deep past. Reconciling the exact distance between Walks's original battle and the Fists of Justice rematch against the specific 157-year countdown the Guardians set in Skip's story requires more precise dating than the show ever actually gives us, and different corners of the show's own fan-compiled chronology land on different guesses about exactly how old Skips is meant to be at any given point. Some placing him in his mid-500s at the start of the series, others suggesting somewhat different totals depending on which flashback and which throwaway line you weight more heavily. I want to be honest that this is less of hard, provable contradiction and more a case of a show doing prophecy the way most shows do prophecy. Setting a specific, dramatic-sounding number in one episode years before anyone had to actually build a timeline around it, and then never quite closing the loop precisely enough for a determined viewer to check its work without hitting a few soft edges. What's not soft at all, what's stated with total clarity and deserves to be sat with rather than rushed past, is the mechanism that keeps Skips alive in the meantime. It isn't automatic. It isn't simply a switch the Guardians flipped once, centuries ago, that has been quietly humming along ever since, with no further input required. Skips has to renew it. Every year, on his birthday, he performs what the show calls the Spirit Dance, a private ritual ode to the beings who granted him his eternal youth in the first place. And there's an entire episode built around what happens when that ritual gets interrupted, when Rigby, meaning well, barrels into the middle of the dance to throw Skips a surprise party, and the Guardians, offended at being denied their due, begin stripping his immortality away on the spot, aging him forward at a visibly accelerating rate until he's practically crumbling to ash in front of his friends before the situation gets salvaged, fittingly, with cake. 500 years of continued existence, in other words, isn't a fact about Skips. It's a bill that comes due annually, quietly, in private, and the show only shows us the 1 year the payment nearly failed to go through. Every other birthday, every other year across 5 centuries, we have to assume the dance happened successfully, off-screen, unremarked, the way you'd assume a furnace kept running through a winter nobody bothered to film. There's something worth naming directly here, because I think it's the emotional hinge. The whole middle section of this video has been slowly turning on without quite announcing itself. Skips and Mordecai are, in a sense, the same paradox wearing two different costumes. Mordecai doesn't age because the show simply never lets him. No ritual, no explanation, no cost, just a number stated once in an early episode and quietly protected from revision ever since. A kind of narrative immortality nobody in the story has to earn or maintain. Skips doesn't age because he pays for it. Every single year, in a private ceremony that costs him something real, that he can fail to perform, that has visibly on screen nearly killed him the one time it went wrong. One character floats above time because the show simply refuses to let time touch him. The other one wrestles with time directly, bodily, annually, and wins only because he keeps showing up to the fight. And the show places these two versions of not aging directly next to each other, working the same job, mowing the same lawns for 8 seasons without ever once drawing a line between them out loud. I don't think that's an accident of writing so much as it's an accident of how long-running shows accumulate meaning. Nobody sat in a room and said, let's build a thematic contrast between effortless youth and earned immortality. But the two structures sat there side by side for long enough that the contrast built itself. The way two trees planted close together will eventually grow into each other's shape, whether anyone planned it that way or not. Now, if you want a version of regular show where none of the ordinary rules apply at all, no continuity to protect, no cost to immortality, no consequence that has to be walked back by the next episode, the show built exactly that space too, and gave it its own name and its own yearly slot, specifically so it could break every rule we've discussed tonight without any of it counting. Every October, starting in its 3rd season and continuing all the way to its last, regular show aired a Halloween special under the umbrella title Terror Tales of the Park, an anthology format explicitly and repeatedly stated both by the creator and by the show's own internal framing device to sit entirely outside the series' regular continuity. Openly modeled on The Simpsons' Treehouse of Horror, these specials exist for one purpose: to let characters actually die permanently, gruesomely, over and over, in ways the ordinary show could never allow without breaking its own tone. Mordecai gets haunted by an uncle he accidentally kills at a bowling alley. A tour bus ages its passengers forward through their entire lives and then past death entirely until they simply cease to exist as infants who were never born. A wallpaper installer turns out to be a monstrous spider who murders the person hanging out with him without a flicker of narrative consequence. In one of the segments, the characters even die twice within the same 22 minutes, are briefly implied to have died a 3rd time, and the show handles this by having a character shrug it off in universe, essentially pointing out that because they're operating under negative continuity, none of it actually sticks. The deaths simply don't count, by design, the way a dream doesn't count once you wake up. What's strange, once you notice it, is that doesn't count is a phrase this show has now, functionally, applied to two very different kinds of story. The wholly non-canonical horror anthology, where the show tells you outright, through its own framing, that nothing you're watching actually happened. And the ordinary run of the series, where things absolutely are meant to have happened, where Skip's immortality and Mordecai's stalled age and every broken and repaired timeline are all treated as real history within the world, except that the real history also, quietly, refuses to let its consequences accumulate the way real history should. The Halloween specials are honest about their own unreality. They tell you plainly, before you even hit play, this doesn't count, watch anyway. The main show never extends itself that same honesty. It lets Mordecai stay 23 and never says why. It lets villains vanish for years and then resurface all at once with a decade of interest attached, and never quite explains where they were keeping themselves in the meantime. In a strange way, the part of regular show explicitly built to be a lie is the most transparent part of the show, and the part built to be the truth is the part actually doing most of the quiet, structural bending. I want to give you a few more of those Halloween images before we move on, because I think the specific texture of them matters more than the general point about non-canon storytelling that I already made. In one of the stronger entries, told by Benson, the house the crew has lived in for the entire run of the show turns out to be haunted by the ghost of a previous owner who has been dead for 200 years. And the horror of that story leans not on gore, but on something quieter and stranger. An old man, glimpsed at the edges of rooms, growing increasingly agitated by small anachronisms, by objects and habits from a century he doesn't recognize, until his haunting curdles from sad to genuinely dangerous. In another, a bed purchased second-hand turns out to have once been something violent in a previous life, and the segment plays coy with its own narrator's reliability in a way none of the show's ordinary episodes ever bother to, letting you wonder, right up until the final shot, whether the person telling you this story is telling it straight or telling it to unsettle the friends listening around the campfire. And in one of the strangest, the crew boards a party bus that ages its passengers forward at an accelerating rate as it drives, faces creasing and hair whitening in real time in the space of a single scene, until Mordecai finally throws the bus into reverse and the aging runs backward instead, past adulthood, past childhood, past infancy, past the point of ever having been born at all, the characters simply blinking out of the story mid-scream. I bring these back up now, at the end of this stretch of the video, because I think they're doing something the ordinary show almost never lets itself do. Showing you, plainly, without a mint or a hug or a dance to soften it, what all of this show's careful, contained time mechanics would actually look like if the safety rails ever failed for good. The party bus aging someone out of existence entirely is the fate a Skips in Time spent an entire episode carefully protecting Skips from. The unreliable ghost story is the fear Bad Kiss quietly raises and then immediately erases, along with the memory that somehow isn't erased. The vengeful 200-year-old spirit is what every single one of those resurrected villains in Exit 9B could have been if the show had let the confrontation end badly even once. Regular show built an entire separate, clearly marked once a year space specifically so it could show you, honestly, exactly how dark its own premises could get if nobody was around to catch the fall. And then it closed the lid on that space every October 31st, filed it under negative continuity, and went right back to pretending for the other 51 weeks of the year that none of its ordinary canonical machinery carried any of that same risk at all. Everything we've talked about tonight, the goofs, the frozen ages, the grandfather paradoxes, the debts coming due, the rituals keeping death at bay, all of it was rehearsal. The show spent 8 seasons quietly practicing how to break and repair its own timeline in small, contained, forgivable ways. And then, in its very last 3 episodes, it took every single one of those techniques and used them all at once, for real, with the entire universe as the thing at stake, instead of a single kiss or a single park. The setup for the finale begins earlier than most viewers realize, in an episode called Cheer Up Pops, which functions as an extended, unhurried goodbye, disguised as a low-stakes hangout episode. The park crew burying a time capsule, of all things, a box of memories meant to be dug up later, a detail that means nothing on its own, but which the show is going to reach back for, deliberately, only 2 episodes later, in a way that turns an innocuous bit of set dressing into the mechanism that saves reality itself. From there, the show moves into its actual endgame. Pops, the gentle, lollipop-headed son of the park's owner, reveals that he has an evil twin brother, Anti-Pops, and that the two of them are not simply siblings, but cosmic opposites, deliberately created by their home planet to balance each other, locked into a fight that has apparently happened before, more than once, across a span of time the show doesn't even attempt to put a number on. The park crew travels to Pops' homeworld to help him prepare for the coming battle, and there, among the planet's native inhabitants, they're shown something that stops the episode cold for a moment. Old carved murals, ancient enough to have weathered visibly, depicting the same fight, the same 2 brothers, colliding again and again across what is clearly meant to be understood as an extremely long, repeating cycle. Every previous iteration of this battle, the murals suggest, and the natives confirm, has ended the exact same way, in a stalemate and in a full reset of the universe. I want to sit with that reveal for a moment longer than the episode itself does, because it changes the entire shape of everything we've discussed so far, retroactively, all at once. If the fight between Pops and Anti-Pops has happened before, repeatedly, and if every previous occurrence has ended with the universe being wiped and restarted, then the version of the universe we've been watching for 8 seasons, the park, the 23-year-olds, Skips and his 500 years, Benson and his gumball head, all of it, is not necessarily the first version of any of those things to have existed. It's simply the current iteration. The show never states this outright in so many words, and I want to be careful to mark the difference between what's shown and what's implied. What's shown, plainly on screen, confirmed by characters within the story, is that this fight has happened multiple times before and has always ended in a total reset. What's implied, and this is where I'm stepping from documented plot into interpretation, is that everything we've watched, every character, every relationship, every single one of the small paradoxes we've spent the last hour walking through might be running on top of a universe that has already been erased and rebuilt an unknown number of times with slightly different, or perhaps entirely identical, casts of characters playing out slightly different, or perhaps entirely identical, versions of the same 8 seasons over and over, forever, until one time, finally, it doesn't reset the same way. That one time is the finale, and it earns the word epic in its own title, honestly. Anti-Pops arrives with an army, and the battle that follows is by far the largest and most consequential the show ever staged. Every ally the show had ever introduced across its run gets folded into the fight, the same way Exit 9B once called in every debt the show owed, except this time the debt being called in is every relationship, every joke, every character the show had spent 8 years building. And then Anti-Pops begins erasing them. Not defeating them, not knocking them out, erasing them, plainly and visibly, characters simply blinking out of existence one after another as his beam sweeps across the battlefield, Muscle Man and High Five Ghost going together, mid-joke, in a moment the show plays for both comedy and genuine devastation at the same time, which is a difficult thing to pull off, and which the show pulls off anyway. Pops, watching his friends disappear, transforms into an enormous Titan version of himself in grief and fury, and the final confrontation escalates into something closer to a kaiju film than anything regular show had ever attempted before. Mordecai and Rigby, watching from a ship, try to physically fly between the two brothers' colliding fists at the exact moment of impact, the only intervention anyone has ever apparently tried in however many previous cycles this fight has run. And the collision erases them too, wipes them cleanly out of the story, and the universe resets. Except this time, it doesn't reset cleanly. The final episode opens by replaying the very first episode of the entire series, shot for shot, line for line. The same argument over a wrestling doll, the same morning, the same house. And for a few unsettling seconds, the show seems to genuinely be threatening to just start the whole thing over from zero, with no acknowledgement that anything ever happened, a fatalistic loop with no way out, the single bleakest possible ending a show like this could choose. But Rigby starts to feel it, a wrongness, a sense that this morning has already happened, that these words have already been said, and it's worth noticing that the show gives Rigby this instinct rather than Mordecai, a small, quiet piece of characterization that suggests Rigby's mind, for all his goofing around across 8 seasons, is somehow more porous to the memory of a timeline that has technically already been erased. He remembers enough to go dig up the time capsule the group buried back in Cheer Up Pops, and inside it is something the show built specifically to survive an apocalypse, a complete boxed set of every memory anyone in the park ever had, gathered and preserved by a character literally named after the format it's stored on. Mordecai touches it, and the entire series comes rushing back into him at once, and armed with that restored memory, the two of them use the very same tool the show has been quietly training us to expect a reset to require, the titular keyboard from the first episode, the literal object called the power, to travel not backward this time, but forward, straight into the middle of the still unresolved battle, arriving in time to be seen, gasping, by their friends, who are astonished to find that some of the people Antipops erased only moments earlier are somehow standing in front of them again. The show calls this a glitch. That's the actual word Rigby uses on screen to explain what's happening. Not a plan, not a strategy, just an acknowledgement that something in the reset process failed to run correctly this time, that their interference in the collision a moment earlier somehow left a crack in the erasure wide enough for memory, and apparently for the two of them specifically, to slip back through. And it's worth being honest that the show never actually explains the mechanism behind that crack in any more technical detail than that single word. Why this cycle, out of however many identical cycles came before it, happened to glitch. Why Mordecai and Rigby specifically were the ones who slipped through the crack rather than being erased cleanly like everyone else who touched that final collision. Why the memory needed a physical object, a boxed set buried in dirt, to be recovered at all, rather than simply surfacing on its own the way Rigby's vague, wordless unease did. These are gaps the show leaves open, and I think it leaves them open on purpose, because filling them in with hard science fiction mechanics would have made the ending colder than the show wanted it to be. The word glitch is doing the same job here that the spirit dance does for Skips's immortality, or that breaking the machines does for the timeline in Bad Kiss. It's a small, almost throwaway phrase, standing in for a much larger, much stranger idea that the show has decided not to look at too directly, because looking at it too directly would mean admitting how strange the whole universe underneath this cartoon actually is. Armed with their restored memory and one more trip through time, Mordecai and Rigby get the chance every previous cycle apparently never had. Foreknowledge. They know how the fight goes wrong. They know Antipops' patterns, his tricks, the traps that didn't get set last time, because nobody remembered to set them. And this time, when Pops finally faces his brother one final time, the resolution isn't a bigger fist, or a cleverer trap, or a more powerful weapon. The show, having spent an entire finale escalating toward the largest, loudest confrontation it had ever staged, resolves the whole thing with Pops simply opening his arms and hugging his brother, refusing to let go even when Antipops warns him that the embrace will kill them both, absorbing his brother's rage and his brother's grief until it burns itself out against sheer, unrelenting kindness. It's a startlingly gentle way to end a battle for the fate of an entire universe, and it costs Pops his life. He dies from the encounter, peacefully, and the show follows him into an afterlife where he's shown watching his friends live on tape, the format of the show's own title finally revealed to be, in some sense, the format his own memory of them takes after he's gone. Now here's where I want to be very deliberate about drawing a line, because everything up to this point is plot, confirmed on screen, plainly stated by characters, and everything I'm about to say next is not that. It's interpretation. It's the kind of thing a show like this leaves sitting on the table without ever picking it up itself, and I think it's worth picking up anyway, carefully, with the understanding that we're now speculating rather than reporting. If this cycle of the Pops and anti-Pops battle is only the most recent in a chain, the murals showed stretching back further than anyone in the story could count. Then somewhere behind this version of Mordecai and Rigby, there may have been other versions, other Blue Jays, other raccoons, other 23-year-olds who worked at other iterations of this exact park, who lived out some version of these same 8 years, who were erased cleanly without a glitch when their own cycle's collision happened, and who left behind absolutely nothing, no capsule, no memory, no crack for anyone to slip through. If that's true, and the show gives us just enough to make it a reasonable guess without ever confirming it, then the Frozen 23 we spent so much time on earlier tonight takes on a very different weight. Maybe Mordecai and Rigby never age within the show, not because of some magical property specific to them, but because none of the previous iterations of them ever got the chance to age either, because the story simply doesn't run long enough, cycle to cycle, for either of them to become anything other than 23 before the reset comes due and wipes the board again. There's one character the show gives us who seems to sit entirely outside this pattern, and she's the detail I keep coming back to whenever I think about this ending, because she's the one piece of the finale that suggests the show understood, on some level it never fully articulated, exactly how heavy the implications of its own reset button actually were. The natives of Pops's home planet include a figure specifically responsible for observing and recording every single one of these battles, a witness whose entire purpose, across however many resets have already happened, is to remain outside the cycle's erasure entirely, to keep watching, to keep some form of continuous memory running underneath a universe that otherwise wipes itself clean every time the fight ends badly. She is, as far as the show tells us, the only consciousness who has seen every previous version of Mordecai and Rigby, every previous version of Skips and Benson and Pops in this park, and lived to remember it. The show never gives her a monologue about what that actually feels like, what it's like to be the one who remembers when nobody else does, to watch the same small, silly conflicts and the same small, real friendships play out generation after generation with no guarantee any given cycle survives. And I think that's a real gap, a moment the show hands you and then simply moves past, trusting you either won't notice or won't need it spelled out. I noticed. I think a lot of people who've sat with this ending long enough eventually notice. And I think the reason the show doesn't spell it out is the same reason it never spelled out why Mordecai stayed 23, or why the spirit dance costs what it costs, or why breaking a time machine erases an afternoon, but not the memory of it. Some doors, this show decided a long time ago, are more useful left slightly open than fully walked through. And then, having just spent 3 episodes breaking the universe open and putting it back together with a hug, the show does the one thing it had refused to do across its entire previous run. It lets its characters age. In the finale's closing minutes, after the battle, after the funeral, the show shifts into a montage set years into the future, and it moves through that future quickly, warmly, without apology. Mordecai becomes an artist, meets someone new at a gallery show of his own work, marries her. Rigby and Eileen, after years of a will they won't they that the show had drawn out with real patience, finally end up together, and the show lets us see them grow old together rather than simply implying it. Benson, Muscle Man, Skips, all of them are shown scattered forward through decades that the show had never previously allowed itself to depict happening to anyone. This is, quite literally, the first and only time regular show ever lets time move forward the way time is supposed to move, accumulating, changing people, aging faces, without a single machine, ritual, or reset stepping in to arrest it. I think that timing is the whole point, and I want to say clearly that what follows is my own reading of the material rather than anything the show states outright. For 8 seasons, this show kept two 23-year-olds locked at 23, while a decade or more of implied history piled up around them, kept an entire cast running on a park that, we now know, may have already run this same loop an unknown number of times before, may have already erased and rebuilt this same set of relationships more times than any character on screen could count. And the moment the loop finally breaks, the moment the reset glitches, the moment the fight resolves through something other than another stalemate, the moment the cycle that had apparently repeated forever finally actually ends, is the exact same moment the show allows its two frozen leads to start aging again. It's tempting, and I think it's fair, to read the park itself and whatever cosmic mechanism kept resetting it as the actual source of that frozen 23 all along, not a writer's choice to keep the joke evergreen, though it may well have started that way, but something the show's own ending retroactively recasts as a symptom of being trapped inside a cycle that was never going to let anyone grow old, because growing old was never the point of any given iteration. The point was always just to get to the fight again, and lose again, and reset again. Only once that machinery finally breaks down for good does anyone in this world get to have an actual future rather than another loop of the same present. If that reading is right, and again, I want to be honest that the show never spells this out in dialogue, then the emotional through line connecting every single thing we've talked about tonight snaps into a shape that feels less like a checklist of writer's room inconsistencies and more like a single, quietly devastating idea the show spent 8 years circling without ever quite landing on directly. A boy who can't age past 23. A man who has to earn another year of life every single birthday or start crumbling to dust. A universe that keeps almost dying and being rebuilt over and over with nobody but one silent witness left to remember any of the versions that didn't make it. And underneath every single one of those images, the same quiet, unspoken question. What does it cost to stay young? And is staying young actually a gift? Or is it just what happens to you while something much bigger than you keeps failing to finish the story properly? Regular show never asks that question in so many words. It just kept building rooms shaped exactly like the question over and over for 8 years, until the day it finally, gently, let its people walk out of the last one and grow old. Before we come back up out of the finale, I want to drop down into one more thread, an old one from the very beginning of the show's run, because I think it belongs in this conversation, even though it isn't technically about time at all. It's about a body. Specifically, it's about the third episode the show ever produced, back when the animation still had a rougher, less settled quality to it, back when even the voices hadn't fully found themselves yet. Mordecai and Rigby are told, mistakenly, that the snacks at the park's snack bar are free for employees, and Rigby, being Rigby, eats an amount of junk food that would concern a doctor, and the next day, his body simply gets up and walks away without him. Not figuratively, literally. His consciousness stays behind, a small green blob rolling around the park grounds, while the physical body that used to carry him around wanders off on its own, eventually getting possessed by a second wandering consciousness, another disembodied soul, this one belonging to a bodybuilder whose own body abandoned him for entirely opposite reasons, having been pushed too hard rather than too little. It's a strange episode to think about in the same breath as the show's later time travel mythology, but I think it belongs there because it's the show's earliest experiment with an idea it would keep returning to for the rest of its run in different clothing. The notion that a person's identity, their actual continuous self, is something separable from the physical continuity of their body, and even, eventually, from the physical continuity of the timeline they're embedded in. Rigby's consciousness survives the loss of his body. Mordecai's memory of his bad breath survives the erasure of the afternoon that gave him that memory. Skips's sense of who he is survives 300 years, a change of name, and the death of the only woman he ever loved. And most strikingly, Mordecai and Rigby's memory of an entire series survives a full cosmic reset that erased everyone and everything else around them. Across 8 years and dozens of writers, in an episode ordering that wasn't planned as a single argument, regular show kept independently rediscovering the same load-bearing idea that whatever you actually are is sturdier, stranger, and more portable than the body or the timeline currently housing it. I don't think the writers sat down in that third episode with any of that in mind. I think they wanted a gross-out body horror joke about eating too many corn dogs. But Ideas a Show returns to enough times, even by accident, even for different reasons each time, start to look less like coincidence and more like an instinct the show couldn't quite shake, the way a person might return to the same dream image for years without ever consciously choosing to. There's a structural paradox sitting underneath all of this that I don't think gets talked about enough, and it has nothing to do with tornadoes or resets or immortal janitors. It's a paradox about what the show even wanted to be, at the level of its own architecture, and I think you can feel it if you watch enough episodes back to back, even without knowing any of the lore we've just spent the last half hour walking through. Regular show was built, at least in its early seasons, to function the way a lot of Cartoon Network comedies of its era functioned, as a loose, reorderable hangout show, one where you could drop into any random episode on any random rerun and understand exactly what you needed to understand within about 30 seconds, because nothing that happened really depended on anything that had happened before it. That's a deliberate, sensible design choice for a show, airing dozens of times a year in constantly shuffled rerun blocks, and for a long stretch of its run, the show mostly honored that design, episode after episode functioning as a clean, self-contained unit. But almost from the beginning, running quietly underneath that reorderable surface was a second show entirely, one that remembered everything, that tracked Skips's 500-year backstory across multiple non-consecutive episodes released years apart, that brought back a video game villain's grown son specifically to settle an old score, that built an entire mythology around Pops's cosmic origin and used it to justify a series finale, that buried a box of memories in the dirt, specifically so a later episode could dig it back up and use it to save reality. Those two shows were never fully reconciled with each other, and I don't think they were ever meant to be. One of them wanted you to be able to watch in any order and lose nothing. The other one was quietly building a decade-spanning epic that rewards more than almost any other show its size ever has, watching in the exact right order and noticing everything. The Halloween specials sit at the exact fault line between those two shows, which is why I think they're worth returning to one more time before we close this out. They are the show at its most honest about which version of itself it's currently being, announcing plainly through the framing device itself, none of this counts. This is the reorderable show wearing its scariest mask. While the regular episodes almost never extend you that same courtesy, letting you guess, unaided, whether the throwaway detail in front of you is disposable filler or the exact seed of a payoff 5 years down the line. That's not a flaw, particularly. I think it's actually close to the honest condition of memory itself, which never announces in advance which of today's small, forgettable moments you'll be asked to recall in vivid detail decades later, and which ones really were as disposable as they felt at the time. Regular Show, almost by accident, built a show that mirrors the actual unpredictability of what memory chooses to keep. You don't get to know, watching episode 2, that the number 23 is going to matter. You don't get to know, watching a throwaway arcade episode, that the loser you just beat is quietly raising a son who will spend years plotting a freeway-shaped act of revenge. The show simply lets those seeds sit there, unmarked, indistinguishable from the 100 other seeds that never sprout into anything, and trusts that if you happen to be the kind of person who remembers everything anyway, the payoff will find you eventually, whether or not you were looking for it. Which brings me to a paradox that isn't really the show's at all. It's yours. It's mine. It's the paradox that belongs to anyone who has ever gone back through a long-running piece of fiction after already knowing how it ends, and I think it deserves a place in this conversation precisely because it's the one paradox in this entire video that isn't confirmed by a wiki page or a screenshot, but is instead something you can only verify by checking your own memory of watching this show whenever and however you first watched it. If you grew up with Regular Show in its original run, you almost certainly didn't watch it in order. You watched whatever happened to be on. You caught the middle of Exit 9B on a random weeknight, with no idea what a chili dog kiss had to do with anything, and you caught a Skips in Time a year later, and you probably didn't watch the finale, until long after you'd already absorbed dozens of episodes that only make emotional sense in light of an ending you hadn't seen yet. Which means that your own personal experience of this show's timeline almost certainly did not run in the same direction the show's internal chronology runs. You may have known Skips was ancient before you ever learned why. You may have felt the ache of Mordecai and Margaret's stalled romance for years before you understood that the reason nothing was ever allowed to permanently change was, in some sense, cosmic rather than merely comedic, that the whole world you were watching may have already run this exact loop before, with the outcome always sliding back to the same starting point, the same 23, the same unresolved Tuesday. That means every person who has ever loved this show carries around their own private, slightly different version of its history, assembled out of order, out of whatever reruns happened to catch them at whatever age they happened to be watching. And I think that's actually a strangely fitting thing for a show. This obsessed with resets and glitches and memories surviving outside their proper timeline to have quietly done to its own audience without ever intending to. The show kept telling us, in a dozen different disguises, that memory doesn't have to move in the same direction as history, that you can know the ending of your own breath problem before you understand why it mattered, that you can remember a version of events the universe itself has already erased, that a photograph signed by a boy who doesn't exist yet can still end up in your attic regardless. And then it went and did the exact same thing to millions of actual children sitting in front of actual televisions, feeding them fragments of an 8-year story in whatever scrambled order the rerun schedule happened to produce, trusting that somehow, eventually, if they cared enough to keep watching, the fragments would resolve into something that felt whole, even though it never arrived in the right order to begin with. I don't think that's a paradox anyone designed on purpose. I think it's just what happens when a show, this patient, gets released into a world that was never going to watch it patiently back. There's a much smaller piece of this puzzle I want to bring in now, almost a footnote by the standards of everything we've already covered, but it belongs here because of how late it arrived. Near the very end of the show's run, well into its time and space era, when the park crew had relocated to a dome floating somewhere among the stars, the show produced a short simply called Time Loop, barely a few minutes long, in which the entire gang gets caught repeating the same small stretch of time over and over. Mordecai coming back from an errand, mentioning he's going to heat up some food, Rigby agreeing to have one too, the two of them settling in front of the television, and then the whole thing simply beginning again, the same lines, the same gestures, looping without any of the grandeur of a Clorgbane prophecy or a cosmic reset behind it. It's a small, almost throwaway piece of animation, closer in spirit to a sketch than an episode, and it doesn't resolve with a big emotional reveal or a lesson learned. It just loops, because looping, by this point in the show's history, had become such a familiar shape to it that the writers could deploy it as a 2-minute gag rather than a season-defining event. I think that short is worth mentioning precisely because of how unremarkable it is. By the time regular show reaches its final stretch, time loops aren't dramatic anymore. They're furniture, The show had spent so many years building for grandfather paradoxes and immortality rituals and cosmic resets that it could finally afford to treat a time loop the way an ordinary sitcom treats a running joke about a broken vending machine. A little bit of texture, tossed off in passing, no explanation required, because the audience by then had been sufficiently trained to understand the shape of the thing without needing it spelled out. That's what a body of lore does to a show, eventually, if it's given enough time to accumulate. What starts as a strange, disorienting rule, Skips is immortal, and here is the entire tragic weight of why ends up compressed down into a shrug, a 2-minute bit, a loop that resolves itself off screen, because by now everyone already knows loops in this universe tend to resolve themselves eventually, one way or another, usually with a hug or a mint or a well-timed dance. And that shrug, I think, is worth taking seriously as its own kind of answer to everything we've been asking tonight, because the show gives us one more character who embodies it directly, and I've saved him for near the end on purpose. Skips has a frenemy, an old one, an eternal one, someone who has apparently known him since somewhere near the very beginning of his 500 years. Someone who shows up at weddings and birthday parties, and even, eventually, to help fight off the erasure of the entire universe alongside everyone else. His name in the show is simply Death, presented not as a horror movie figure, but as a recurring, slightly put upon regular at the same parties everyone else attends, someone whose job, we're told plainly, has been made considerably harder by the fact that his oldest friend struck a deal that keeps sidestepping him indefinitely. There's something almost unbearably gentle about that choice if you let yourself sit with it rather than laugh past it the way the show wants you to laugh past most things. A show built entirely around a character who cannot die invites, structurally, a character whose entire purpose is making sure everyone eventually does. And rather than treat that tension as horror or as tragedy or even really as philosophy, the show treats it as friendship. Two old acquaintances who've been sparring gently for centuries, who show up to each other's parties, who play against each other in games, who seem, in whatever strange way immortal beings manage friendship, to actually like each other, despite representing the two furthest possible ends of what it means to exist in time. I don't think it's a coincidence that this is the character the show chooses to stand beside every other piece of its cosmology in the finale, present for the battle, present for the reset, present, presumably, for whatever happens to Pops once his own body finally gives out from the effort of that last enormous hug. Death doesn't get a dramatic final confrontation in this show. He gets invited to the wedding, he gets a seat at the party, and maybe that's the quietest, truest thing regular show ever says about all the time travel and immortality and cosmic resets it spent 8 years building around itself, that none of it, not the freezing, not the looping, not the glitching, was ever really trying to defeat the thing at the center of all of it. It was just trying to make peace with sitting next to it a little longer before the tab finally comes due. Go back for a second to the exact moment the finale finally breaks the cycle, because I don't think we've looked closely enough yet at how small the actual fix turns out to be. After all those repeated failures recorded on the old planetary murals, after however many nameless, forgotten iterations of this fight ended the same losing way, the thing that finally tips the balance isn't a bigger weapon or a cleverer trick pulled from some deep well of cosmic knowledge. It's traps. Ordinary, physical, almost childish traps, the kind of thing you'd rig up in a backyard to catch a raccoon rather than to stop a god, laid out by Mordecai, an artist by inclination, a groundskeeper by circumstance, someone who has spent the entire series being underestimated by literally everyone around him, including, frequently, himself. The show lets him be the one who finally looks at an eternal, repeating cosmic tragedy and asks the single question none of the previous cycles apparently thought to ask. What if Pops just had a little help this time? Not more power. Help. A rope here, a distraction there, friends standing exactly where they needed to stand at exactly the right second. There's a detail worth sitting with in how the show frames Pops in the moments leading up to that final confrontation, because it colors everything that follows. Before the battle even properly begins, Pops has a nightmare about it, and his friends gather around him afterward not to strategize, not to plan traps, but simply to comfort him the way you'd comfort anyone frightened of something enormous and unavoidable bearing down on them. That's the emotional register the show insists on carrying into a fight for the survival of the universe, not war room tension, but bedside tenderness. And it pays that tenderness off, eventually, at the very end of the fight, when Pops chooses to resolve an ancient cycle of violence, not with force, but with an embrace so total it costs him his own life. If you've been sitting with the darker implications of everything else in this video, the resets, the erased prior cycles, the frozen ages, the debts that never stop accruing, this is the moment the show finally, deliberately, offers you something to set against all of it. Every other loop in this show gets broken by a machine, a keyboard, a ritual, a trick. This one, the biggest one, the one carrying the weight of every reset that came before it, gets broken by someone simply refusing to let go of his brother, even when letting go would have saved his own life. That's not a plot mechanism. That's the show finally telling you, plainly, what it actually thinks breaks a cycle that violence alone never could. There's one more piece of the epilogue worth pulling into the light, because it's the part of the ending that quietly confirms everything we've speculated about the frozen years finally being allowed to move again. Buried in the closing montage, alongside the marriages and the new careers and the decades passing in the space of a few edited seconds, the show gestures toward a future reunion, old friends, gray now, gathering again at the site of a park that has presumably long since stopped being their daily life, catching up on years that, for the very first time in this show's history, are allowed to actually be years, with weight, with visible change, with faces that look different from the faces we spent 8 seasons memorizing. Fans doing the arithmetic afterward, using the ages and timelines the show gives us in its final stretch. Mordecai and Rigby confirmed at 23 near the beginning, a stated 6 more years of employment mentioned late in the run, a further few years spent stationed out in space before their return have generally landed somewhere in their late 20s to early 30s by the time they finally leave the park's orbit for good, and somewhere in their 50s by the time a milestone reunion would plausibly happen. I want to be clear that this specific arithmetic is fan reconstruction rather than an on-screen statement of exact ages at every step, stitched together from scattered lines across different seasons rather than handed to us all at once in a single tidy timeline, but it's reconstruction built on real, stated numbers rather than invented out of nothing, and it lines up cleanly with the emotional shape the finale is clearly reaching for. What that arithmetic actually confirms, regardless of exactly which numbers you land on, is the thing that matters most for everything we've walked through tonight. The freeze finally broke, permanently, the moment the two of them stepped outside the park's own gravity for the last time. 23 held for the better part of a decade of implied in-universe years, while they stayed inside the loop, inside the job, inside whatever unnamed mechanism kept resetting the board around them, cycle after cycle. And then, once the actual cosmic cycle finally resolved, once Pops's hug did what generations of failed battles apparently couldn't, age simply started moving again, quietly, without any ritual required to explain it, the way water starts moving again the instant you lift a hand off the surface of it. The show never announces this as a rule. It just lets you watch it happen, one wrinkle and one wedding, and one gray hair at a time, trusting that if you've been paying attention to everything that came before it, you won't need it explained. You'll just feel the difference, the way you feel the difference between a room where a clock has been ticking quietly the whole time and a room where someone has just, finally, wound it back up. Which brings me, finally, to the word sitting in the show's own title, the word I think holds more weight than anyone involved in naming the show probably intended it to carry. Regular, not extraordinary, not epic, though the finale eventually claims that word for itself. Regular, as in ordinary, as in unremarkable, as in the ordinary daily grind of mowing lawns and avoiding a boss and failing over and over to say the right thing to the person you like. And underneath that regular surface, this show spent 8 years quietly assembling one of the strangest, densest, most emotionally serious mythologies about immortality, memory, and cosmic repetition that has ever aired disguised as a children's cartoon. Every paradox we've walked through tonight, the shirt that repaired itself, the age that never moved, the grandfather trap in a time-nado, the machine that erased an afternoon but not the memory of it, the resurrected villains settling old debts, the annual dance keeping a 900-year-old man from crumbling to dust, the murals recording an unknown number of failed universes, the glitch nobody can fully explain, the hug that finally worked where centuries of force never had. Every single one of them was hiding underneath the word regular the entire time. That's not a contradiction. I think, by the end, it's the whole point. The show kept insisting, gently, patiently, across 8 years, that the most enormous things a life can contain, the fear of ceasing to exist, the grief of losing someone, the terror of watching time take everything from you piece by piece, the strange mercy of occasionally getting a second chance nobody else got. all of it happens inside the exact same regular, unremarkable, Tuesday-shaped life that the rest of us are living right now, whether or not a tornado ever comes through to make it obvious. I don't think regular show set out, in its second episode, to build any of this. I think it set out to make a joke about two lazy guys and a boss shaped like a gumball machine. But shows that run long enough and are made by people who keep caring past the point where they technically had to tend to accumulate meaning the way a house accumulates the smell of everyone who's ever cooked in it, not on purpose, not all at once, just slowly, meal by meal, until one day you walk in and the whole place smells unmistakably, permanently like itself. This show smells like itself now. It smells like 8 years of small, broken rules quietly repairing themselves, like a friend who ages differently than you do, but shows up every single day anyway, like a photograph in an attic signed by a version of someone who doesn't exist yet, like a hug that costs everything and is worth it anyway. That's what was sitting at the bottom of all this the whole time. Not a puzzle to solve. A shape to recognize, slowly, the way you recognize your own life, only after enough of it has already happened to look back on. If any of this kept you company tonight, if it gave you something to think about in whatever dark room you're lying in right now, that's genuinely all I was hoping for. Give the video a like if it did. It helps more than you'd think. And if you'd like to sit with more of these slow, patient walks through things you already loved without ever quite looking at them this closely, subscribe, and I'll see you the next time we go looking for what's underneath something regular. Good night.